I'm Dan Cohen, this is Behind the Headlines. Election day has come and gone, we still have no clear winner and may not know for several days. Nonetheless, President Donald Trump has falsely declared himself victorious and the victim of electoral fraud.
We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. This is a major fraud in our nation. We want the law to be used in a proper manner. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list, okay?
4 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday is around the time Biden overtook Trump's lead in a handful of key states like Wisconsin. And while Trump and his supporters claim there was fraud, there has been no evidence of any cheating so far. Rather, mail-in votes continued to be counted throughout the night and early morning hours. While some claim the late-night swing in Biden's favor is evidence of an anti-Trump conspiracy, as journalist Rania Khalek pointed out, this change was to be expected. She wrote on Twitter, Democratic voters fear COVID more, so many voted by mail or early because on election day there might be long lines and voter suppression, whereas Republicans don't think COVID's as big of a deal and Trump told them mail voting is fraudulent, so they voted more in person on election day. So it makes sense that the mail-in ballots, which are counted last, would tip the scales in Biden's favor. And as the New York Times reported, in a number of states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, local Republican officials blocked Democrats' efforts to make it easier to count ballots cast before Election Day, raising the possibility of a drawn-out count in some of the most important battlegrounds. Nonetheless, Trump says he'll take his case to the Supreme Court and has filed multiple lawsuits in Pennsylvania and Michigan while demanding a recount in Wisconsin, setting the stage for a protracted legal battle. At the same time, Trump supporters are harassing and attempting to intimidate poll workers and force them to stop counting mail-in ballots in several cities across the country. This is in Detroit, which has a predominantly African-American population. In Phoenix, a debunked conspiracy theory spread about Trump votes being thrown away because they were filled out with a Sharpie marker.
Where are the votes? Where are the votes? Where are the votes? Where are the votes?
While Trump's attempt to hijack the election might surprise some observers, he had been openly advertising his strategy for weeks. But the obedient Washington press corps, so accustomed to performing stenography rather than journalism, failed to convey what Trump had in store. The Washington Post reported that Trump had already prepared an enormous team of lawyers set to spring into action as soon as Election Day ended. Trump had also been claiming that counting ballots after the election is illegal, a flat-out lie that media outlets didn't challenge. While the president's tactics of encouraging voter suppression aren't gaining much traction inside the US, similar and even violent acts in countries targeted by the US receive bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans salivating for regime change. Back in March, a far-right militant group falsely claimed fraud in Venezuela's election and set fire to a building containing nearly all of the country's electoral machines. And Trump's strategy of prematurely declaring victory and falsely claiming fraud as the vote changes out of his favor has a precedent. It's a tried and true method the US, both Democrats and Republicans, supported to mount a fascistic military coup in Bolivia and oust the democratically elected president Evo Morales just a year ago. Carlos Mesa, the opposition candidate and favorite of Washington, was trailing Morales in the polls early on and facing elimination, but falsely declared he had enough votes to make it to a second round of voting. Like Trump, he lied, claiming there was fraud, and called on his right-wing base of support to take to the streets. As votes from Bolivia's rural area, which is Morales' base of support, surged later, this too was called evidence of fraud. That's exactly what Trump is trying to pull off. The difference is that phony allegation of cheating in Bolivia had support from US politicians and corporate media outlets who were thrilled to see the popular socialist leader Morales threatened and forced to flee his country in a military coup d'etat.
Pro-Cuba regime headed by Evo Morales, who sought to maintain his grip on power through electoral fraud.
The former Bolivian president was forced to resign amid protests and allegations of election fraud.
In the immediate aftermath, the junta murdered several supporters of Morales' movement towards socialism party. For months on end, Mas Party supporters launched strikes, resisted persecution, and protested against the US-supported coup regime, ultimately reclaiming their democracy with an overwhelming victory in last month's election. Here in the US, it's hard to see how Trump's attempt to hijack the election will succeed, but it's hardly a banner day for American democracy. Of course, anti-democratic hijinks aren't only the domain of Trump. After his 2016 victory, the Democratic Party sought to reverse the results through a series of elaborate deceptions and hoaxes. First, the Russiagate conspiracy theory that claimed Trump was a traitor and puppet of Vladimir Putin. This, of course, failed in spectacular and embarrassing fashion. Then it was the Ukraine-gate pseudo-scandal that culminated with a failed impeachment. At one point, the secret police agency known as the FBI even considered removing Trump from office, a totally anti-democratic move. And in the election, the public has been subjected to a barrage of evidence-free warnings from intelligence agencies and Democratic Party media apparatchiks about Russian, Chinese, and Iranian interference, all as an excuse in case Biden ends up losing.
You have disinformation, and now you have this weird synergy where Russia and Iran are magnifying the ugliness that's being put out by our own president.
It's Iran, it's China, it's Russia. It's those who want to see this kind of discord disrupt our democracy, which is the greatest democracy on the planet. And that's what upsets me. I hope we can get past that.
We know Russia, China, Iran have attempted to sow discord in the U.S.
Talk a little bit about the expectations leading in tonight, the worries about Russia and Iran and meddling in our election.
U.S. Cyber Command did take offensive military action against government-linked hackers in both Russia and Iran.
So regardless of the outcome, this should be a moment of reflection for American voters. Both of our political parties operate more like rival mafia clans. They resort to dirty tricks and deceptions to maintain their grip on power and are assisted by their respective corporate propaganda outlets. They use outright voter suppression and gaslight the public into believing some foreign threat is lurking inside their ballot envelopes. Whichever right-wing septuagenarian emerges victorious, it's impossible to call any of this a clean democratic process. If this was happening in a country the US wanted to overthrow, we'd be seeing calls for military intervention, fake humanitarian aid stunts, and a no-fly zone over the White House.